Disclaimer: I'm a law student. Any legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. Hi. Let's begin with a hypothetical. Let's say that you are an apartment tenant. Let's say that you're an apartment tenant, and let's say that you don't have the easiest ride in life. Let's say that you live in a situation where you work maybe 2 to 3 jobs. You don't have the most stable income. Let's say that you don't even work a job that offers you health benefits. Let's say that you're in such a position where as you're working, in fact, let's even be more specific. Let's say that you work in the food industry. And let's say that you were specifically working as a waiter or a waitress at a restaurant. All right? Let's say that you did that, or let's say that you had multiple jobs in that area, right? And let's say that one day you get the news that you and all of your coworkers are being let go because of this thing which has permeated all of our lives until the end of time, the coronavirus. Let's say that you end up losing a substantial amount of your income, if not all of it entirely. All right? And let's say that you're in a situation where you have a good amount of costs coming up very quickly, one of which including rent. And let's say that because of all the expenses in your life, that even a $1,200 stimulus check from the government isn't going to help you. And let's say that you and some other people in your apartment building or in your apartment complex have been sort of figuring out the same thing, right? Like there's a lot of other people who live around you who are in very, very similar situations. And let's say that eventually one of you gets the idea to organize a strike. You think, actually, you know what? I understand that we are renting from you right now. I get that. I understand that we have a contract and that I'm here on your terms. But it's kind of a fuck situation, right? Like, you're saying that if I cannot pay you, then what? You're going to kick me to the curb? You're going to evict me in the middle of a pandemic? That's outrageous. Especially because I, under normal circumstances, even if I wanted to pay you, and even if I normally could, I just can't right now. I lost my job. I lost my income, along with a lot of other people. And let's say that these lot of people figure out that they just collectively might be able to accomplish something by doing a strike. And let's say that they start going ahead with one, or at least they start planning to have one, if they haven't started already. Question: what are the rights of both the people who are striking as well as the landlords who are charging these people rent? So, hey, welcome everyone. Glad that you're all here. Thank you for coming. And yeah, we're talking about the rent strike, right? Now, I'm going to warn you, I'm going to be doing a little differently than I normally do because I've been traveling recently and I just finished finals this week, and I am starting a process called petitioning, which means that from today until May 12th, I'm going to be just writing mountains and mountains of paper, or mountains and mountains of legal analysis, right? So just bear with me. I'm not sure how much content I'm going to be uploading during that time, but I'll keep you all updated. But very interestingly, today specifically, it's Labor Day, and there's a lot of discussion. I uploaded a video talking with someone previously about rent strike, or talking about the general strike that is supposed to be happening today. I have not been following the details. I've been traveling, so I advise you to keep looking into that and to see what other people are doing, right? If there is something very substantial happening in the nation, then one of the most important things, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, is to show general support, right? But for me, now this is going to be, I have to be careful as I'm doing this video, right? Because what I'm going to do, right? Like what I can contribute to the conversation is that I just finished my class on property, right? I learned about property law. I learned everything that they generally teach law students when they are studying property in law school, right? And there's some interesting pieces of information to learn from there, but I just need to make it, like, some things I can't do, right? So, like, understand that there are things I can do and that I can't do, being that I have not passed the bar yet. What I cannot do is draw a legal conclusion or give legal advice, right? And generally, under both of those circumstances, that means I cannot apply legal principles to real life circumstances and come to a conclusion. What I can do is I can talk generally. Well, I mean, like, there are other ways around it, and I've talked around this restriction. I've talked about in other videos. But one thing that I can do that I'm going to be doing here, right? Because here the law does matter. I'm just going to talk about things which I learned about, which might relate to what's happening. And if it doesn't relate, then it's just good to know, right? If you ever plan on renting from someone, then, like, or if you currently are in a contract, like if you currently have a lease, then this is just good information to know, right? And honestly, like, we live in a society where, and this is weird, and I'll make another video about this, but the law has this expectation, heavy quotations, it has this expectation that everyone reasonably knows the law and can follow it, right? Especially in the criminal law, that's something that the law presumes exists in society, right? Except we live in a society where really some of the most gatekept knowledge available is legal information, right? It's kind of funny to think about, actually, because most people's excuses to, there's this principle, I'm trying to remember the name of it from criminal law, where there is a defense that exists where you can bring up if a law was recently promulgated or promulgated in such a way where a reasonable person would not know that it was actually a law. Like, for example, if a city instituted a law where anyone who just moved into the city from a certain part of another city or who had a criminal record or something similar, then they would be required to register with, like, a local registry. That's actually an example of a law which was previously struck down in the case because it was deemed to be something which was too abstract or something which the reasonable average person wouldn't know about, right? So, like, that defense exists as a thing out there. But for the most part, I think that we can all agree that, like, it's hard to get access to the law, right? So maybe this is something I'll do a little bit more on my channel. For now, I'm just going to talk about general legal principles, which may or may not relate to this, and I'll let you all do with it what you will. All right? And mind you, I didn't have time to prepare a formal presentation, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to be referencing my, you can call this a research document. What the proper term is an outline, right? This is the outline that I created from taking property this past semester, right? It has absolutely everything that I learned from day one to the last one. I'm currently thinking about whether or not I want to make this open source. I might. I just have to, like, the only reason that I'm thinking about not doing that is just because I need to make sure I'm allowed to. I should be able to, because, like, people talk about this kind of stuff regularly. Like, it's a very, like, it can be a useful document. So I'll look into that, and if I can, then I'll link it either somewhere in my Discord or on the video I'll put out from this, right? But where is important for us to go is to leaseholds. All right? Now, something that we need to understand before going into this is a broad idea that sort of encompasses all of property law, right? Ignore what's over here for a second. I'm just going to explain some principles to you, right? Property law is organized around this idea called numerus clausus, right? And what that means is that any kind of property that exists, right? And we're generally talking about real property, right? Like personal property, like things you can hold, and like intellectual property, that's all well and good. But when we're talking about real property generally is categorized according to this thing called the numerus clausus principle, which means that every kind of real property fits into one of a small and definite number of categories, and it can only fit into one, and that's it. Like, for example, if you have a house, that house, it fits into some categorization or some terminology, and only one. None of, like, there's no intermingling. There's no, like, sliding scale between two different categories. It is one or the other. All right? Now, another day, like, it might be good to talk about generally the estate system on another day, but that is a lot, right? Like, if you want to talk about like laws which are convoluted for the sake of being convoluted, that is a great example. And a lot of people talk about like the reasoning why, being that, you know, it was written in such a way where it highly advantaged the interests of people with the most money and capital when it was promulgated initially in like England, right? So I just laughed at the comment. I couldn't help it, but yes. Anyway, so the estate system is a whole bit, right? Today we're just going to focus on the leasehold system, right? The leasehold estate, the leasehold system, because that's what's really important here, right? What's important to know is that there are 4 different types of leaseholds. You have the term of years, the periodic tendency, the tenancy at will, and the tenancy at suffrage. All right. A term of years is an estate that lasts for some fixed period of time, or for a period computatable by a formula that results in fixing calendar dates for beginning and ending once the term is created or becomes possessory, right? If you go to your landlord and you have a lease for 1 year or 2 years or 3 years or 6 months or however long, right? Like if you have it for a definite period of time, that is the term of years estate. All right. Hypothetically, we're talking in hypotheticals, no application. Disclaimer. Right. The periodic tenancy is a periodic a lease for a period of some fixed duration that continues for succeeding periods until either the landlord or the tenant gives notice of termination, usually in the form of like 6 months at minimum, right? Like that's the standard minimum requirement. Now, when you have this is usually like if you have a lease that says that every month you're going to be charged X number of dollars, right? Or actually, no, sorry, that's not right. If you have a contract that says that you are on a lease for renewal upon every year, right? That will be renewed every year unless notified by either party of termination of it. That would be an example of a periodic tenancy. A tenancy at will is a tenancy of no fixed period that endures so long as both landlord and tenant desire. This might be what a lot of people are in. Generally speaking, this is a lot more flexible, right? This would technically be like what I was in when I was living down in the South with Faith, right? Like I moved in and we didn't have like a fixed amount of time where I was paying the landlord, but like I paid rent to the landlord and the landlord was like, all right, as long as you keep paying me every month, then you're free to live here, right? That's an example of tenancy at will, right? Or at least as far as I'm aware as a law student, disclaimer, yada, yada. And then there's the tenancy at suffrage, which is the 4th one. Now, I'm going to return to this one because this is about to become very, very important, all right? But so far, I just want to check in. We have 4 different categories, all right? We have the periodic tenancy, we have tenancy at will, we have term of years, and the tenancy of suffrage. Those are the only 4 types of leaseholds that can exist. Your leasehold, I'm not sure. Again, this is hard because I have to make sure I can say things I'm allowed to. Any lease that exists, as far as I am aware, can only fit into one of these 4 categories. That is it. No more, no less. It must go in one. It must go into one of the buckets. All right? Now, how this applies here, right? Like why this is relevant to know here is because it's important to talk about the duties of landlords, right? At the beginning, I talked about the rights of both tenants and landlords, right? But there are also certain duties that a landlord owes to its tenants, or just by virtue of being a landlord. Specifically, a landlord has a duty to take reasonable efforts to mitigate damages when he seeks to recover rents due from a defaulting tenant. All right? So I want to just digest this a little bit with y'all. What this means is that let's say, hypothetically, let's say that you are a person who goes on rent strike. Let's say that that's something that happens, completely hypothetically. If that is the case, then it's not just that your landlord can just start going out of their way to start charging you oodles and oodles of cash for defaulting. They have to try and take reasonable efforts to mitigate their losses from you, right? The reason why is because the landlord is a much better position for finding tenants. Now, the law here will talk a lot. Now, mind you, a lot of the law that I learned about does not talk about the situation where you have someone who is rent striking. It's not something which is discussed a lot in American law, or at least not as much in the class that I took. But it's important to understand that when you have someone who's defaulting, it's not as if the landlord can just make. Yeah, exactly. It's not as if you're in such a situation where the landlord just has no duty to mitigate the damages that they would incur whatsoever from you not paying them, right? They have a duty to do something. Again, like this can be a little elastic. Reasonable efforts is usually like whatever reasonable efforts is defined as, like usually that's something determined in the court of law. Like if you were to be sued or someone were to be sued over whether or not a landlord took reasonable efforts, right? Like that's something that like a jury or a judge would decide, right? But they have a duty, like it's baked into the law, right? Like it's something which every landlord has regardless of their status, right? So that is important to remember because it's not as if you can get into a situation where a landlord, like let's say that a whole apartment building starts defaulting, right? Say the whole apartment building starts defaulting. It's not as if the landlord can just start charging them and sending bills off to their bank or whatnot, right? Like, if they are able to, that's possible, but they have to take other efforts to mitigate the overall damage first, right? Like, if you're just not in your, usually when this comes up, right? Like, the stereotypical example is when you, as a tenant, just leave your apartment before your actual contract or lease expires, right? And there are certain periods of time where your apartment is occupied, but you still have a lease there, right? The common law, what it tells us is that actually, instead of the landlord just constantly charging you over and over for every month that you weren't there, they actually have to take reasonable efforts to try and put someone into that apartment, right? They can't just charge you willy-nilly because you had your name signed to a contract. They have to try and decrease the overall amount of damage. And the reason that is put on them is because they're in the best position to resolve that issue. Okay? One really interesting example. This is sort of related. This is one case that we read about where there was a rent strike, right? Or one example that we talked about in class. So here's another hypothetical. We're just going to kind of walk through it, right, and talk about it. L owns a high-rise apartment building. L's entire maintenance and janitorial staff goes on strike for 2 weeks. The building's incinerators are inoperative as a consequence of the strike. Tenants must take their garbage to the curb in paper bags supplied by L. City sanitation workers refuse to cross the striking employees' picket lines, and trash piles up to the height of the building's first floor windows. The garbage exudes noxious odors and results in a declaration of health and emergency by the city. Routine maintenance and extermination service is not performed during the strike, and rats and vermin become a problem. Right, so we're talking about a long, sort of domino effect of problems that come from this strike, right? eventually making it uninhabitable to live there. Has L, the landlord, breached the implied warranty of habitability? Before we get into that, what is that? The implied obligation or the implied warranty of habitability is an implied obligation to residential leases to maintain the premises in a minimally habitable conditions by the landlord. This is not waivable. This is something that every landlord has to do immutably. All right? And in the situation that we talked about, there is a breach because there are other options available to the landlord to resolve the issue. In other words, to adhere to the strike. This is a really interesting example where if you have a strike, right? Like where you have people who organize in such a way as to be able to demand certain rights and respect from their employers or from where they live, right? Where the law will end up siding with the people who are striking, right? Like this is a very interesting example. Now, this goes more specifically to the implied warranty of habitability. It's hard to say whether or not the same principle will apply in rent striking, but it is important to recognize, right? Again, I cannot make a legal conclusion. That's something I have to leave to you. Like that would be almost certainly to be a legal conclusion for me to say that would apply here. But it is something I'll just put out there for y'all. Now, something I want to bring up, because so we've talked about sort of some of the rights that can be owed to some of the rights that can be had by tenants and workers who strike. Now we do have to talk about some of the rights. And this is the risk, right? Like there is risk. I know, right? No, but there is risk with going on a strike. And I remember I was watching Vosh's stream the other day, and he talked a little bit about how, he was still coming to opinion, and that he talked a little bit about how there are certain, there's a lot to consider, right? And that a lot of things can very easily go wrong if you're not careful. And I think that's absolutely right. There's two different things to consider here, right? There's sort of the social aspect, and then there's also the legal aspect. This is where we return to the tenancy at suffrage. This is the fourth of those four categories. This comes up in that question of what happens when you, as someone with a lease, right? You have a lease to an apartment from a landlord, or a lease to, some other residential land, right? There is this question about what happens to the status of that land or your lease after you stop paying. Because remember, we're going back to numerus clausus. Everything, like all pieces of land, all leasehold estates, they must go into one category. They can't, it can't be just non-categorized. It has to go into one category at all times, right? And this is where the tenancy at suffrage comes from. Because what the common law says, the common law rule gives the landlords confronted with a holdover, right? Someone who doesn't pay but is still living in their, still living in the space that they did rent. Essentially two options. The first is eviction plus suing for damages. They can say, hey, you have to get out of here in 8 days. If you don't get out of here, I'm calling the police, and if you stay any longer, then I'm going to sue you, in addition to all the damages, like damages just referring to things like the money that you're supposed to have owed me, right? Like they can evict you and sue you for anything that you still owe them, right? That's one option. Or, conversely, consent, express or implied, to the creation of a new tenancy. What kind of tenancy? The tenancy at suffrage. The so-called tenancy at suffrage arises when a tenant remains in possession or holds over after the termination of the tenancy, right? So let's say that you're in a situation where you have what's a good example? Like a term of years estate. Let's say that you're in a position where you have a term of years estate, and you, like, the date comes where it's the last day that you're supposed to be, living in your apartment, and you have not paid and you have not moved out. All right. What happens because now your previous estate does not exist. Like it just doesn't, right? Like the time has expired, it came to its end, it's gone. But you're still living there. This is generally what tends to be defined as a tenancy at suffrage. Examples include like a squatter or someone who just kind of like moves in, right? Like if you have like if I don't know, I don't know if anyone can relate to this, right? But where you're in a position where you like let's say hypothetically, again, like I have to make sure I'm not applying law. I am trying my best. People who evaluate me, bar review committee, please understand I am trying my best to toe the line here. Please have mercy on me. But anyway, so from what I understand from my class, let's say hypothetically you are in such a position where Baltimore is burning. No, let's say that you're in such a position where you're just a standard house owner or you're a standard apartment owner or whatever. You have somewhere to, like you have either an apartment that you're renting or a house that you're renting, or you just own a home. All right. Let's say that your friend just comes over to crash with you. All right. And let's say that they end up staying long enough that it's sort of implied and understood between the two of you that they are living there somewhat definitely, right? Or at least, that they are staying longer than just an average guest, right? Again, this is like very sort of wishy-washy territory. For example, like my apartment building requires that anyone who stays longer than 10 days be put on my lease so that they're not, in a tenancy at suffrage, right? So that they can just like become part of the lease, right? But it varies depending on the circumstances. Well, generally they'd be labeled as having a tenancy in suffrage, according to what I learned. So why is that relevant? Well, it can carry some really, really, really not great consequences. For example, in Baltimore, landlords can charge double rent to people who are classified as having a tenancy in suffrage. All right. If my landlord, like, let's say that the circumstances arose such that let's say that I was striking, and let's say that I let my current lease expire, right? And I stayed remaining in my apartment. Like, let's just say I stayed here, I didn't pay, I didn't do anything. Well, they could start charging me my original fee. If they didn't try to evict me, they could try to evict me, but honestly, this would probably be like the better play. Again, hypothetically, they could evict me and sue me for whatever I didn't pay, or they could not evict me and start charging me double my rent, and just let those build up over time until eventually they got to such a point where then they start trying to sue me for all the damages that have accumulated while I have remained living here. This is clearly a very, very bad situation to be in, right? Because this is sort of what I worry about when people are going on strike. Now, mind you, this is not saying that people should not strike. This isn't. This is just putting the warning label on the cigarettes, right? That people will try this. And this goes back to what Vosh was saying on his stream, that honestly, most of the time, the most important thing with doing a successful strike is having widespread public support. All right? Understand that these are things that a landlord can do, but that does not mean that they will do them. They have options, right? And the most important thing to remember is that if a landlord does not think that they can justifiably get away with charging people who otherwise don't have anywhere else to go, and, otherwise evicting an entire apartment building, right, of all of its residents, if they don't think that they can get away with that with public, with the amount of public support the people in there have, they likely won't. All right? But that is heavily, heavily, heavily dependent on people, on having like widespread public support, because otherwise they can make a lot of money. They can make a lot of money, or at least they can try to. Again, like, this goes back to that whole idea of my torts professor would always say, you can't get blood from a turnip, right? I would extend that just a little bit to say, you can't get blood from a turnip, but if you let it happen, certain people will certainly try. Okay? So, yeah. It's a weird situation to be in. I certainly hope that people are going about striking in the best way that they can right now. And that's why to everyone who's watching, and who will be watching this in the future, I'm going to try and put this up on YouTube. And I'm just really, again, committee, I'm trying to do my best if you're watching this in the future. But it is important that people understand sort of the law, and though I'm not applying it to any particular situations, that people just understand what their rights are, right? And here we're in such a situation where a lot of people certainly probably have the right idea, but the people who are being largely and disproportionately affected are people with very minimal access to education, to very minimal access to legal advice, very minimal access to the means to improve their own lives. And so if people are pursuing a general strike, or even just like very localized strikes, whether it's with their places of work, or whether it has to do with their places where they live, right? I hope that this is at least helpful if people want to just learn a little bit more about the law and about their rights. So yeah. Otherwise, I think I'm going to leave it there.